Welcome to this installment of supplemental lectures provided by PNC's Concurrent Enrollment Program. My name is Alexandra Kindle, and I will share some information with you that comes out of my history courses at Purdue University North Central. When I first started teaching U.S. history survey classes, I stopped the class at Richard Nixon's downfall with the Watergate scandal. That was the last decade that was truly history for me. But over time, as students are farther removed from the 1970s, I've added information about later periods. Most recently, I put together this lecture to help my students understand the troubles we are currently in and how they connect to what is seemingly the distant past to them, the 1980s and 1990s. To best understand this lecture, I would listen to the lecture on Ronald Reagan, but it is not necessary. I chose the image from Time magazine because while there was more to the 1990s than just the internet highlights, or the topic of the internet highlights the greatest changes between my generation and yours. It has changed how we interact with media and each other. We do business differently, and it has affected how we perceive threats to our nation and our way of life. Thus, this lecture will hit upon some of the major differences between your generation and that of many of your instructors, including me. It is for this reason I have titled this lecture the IDK Generation. It should give you some idea of why Generation Xers like myself look at the millennials and don't understand them, and millennials would just say IDK. One last comment before we start. This is a very personal lecture because it is about my time in college, and I've provided it for young people who I teach who are at the same stage of life as the time period I lived in the lecture. History is the study of change over time, so I have found it useful to compare the differences between those two experiences. The changes are significant. I started college in 1990. Here are a few things about life in the early 1990s that we will use to compare to the present. Let's start with college. When I give this lecture at PNC, I'm talking to college students. When I went to college in the 1990s, I started at a community college, and the tuition was $30 per semester. That was for a full-time load. So I was not going into any student loan debt to go to college. The students that I teach now pay significantly more than $30 per semester and are taking on a lot of debt. Another area of comparison has to do with technology. In the 1990s, I had a beeper, and that was pretty technologically hip for the time. I was also very happy to have a Walkman like this one. When people wanted to share music, we made mixtapes, which were so hard to make that giving someone a mixtape also meant the maker liked the person enough to sit for the entirety of the recording session. Mixtapes were a labor of love. Also, it was in college that I could get access to a computer that was connected through a modem. There I used a new thing called the World Wide Web to write emails. Another area that we'll talk about in this lecture has to do with politics. The Cold War was over. Our long-standing enemy, Russia, of so many years, 40 or so years, seemed to be conquered. George H.W. Bush was president. I voted for him in my first possible presidential election, and he started the first Gulf War in 1991. Oh, and he hated broccoli, just so you know. We all did. Let's go on to economics. It was a pretty prosperous time, but for the U.S., it had become, as of 1985, a net importer and a debtor nation. So it was an uneven prosperity, but hope was possible. It was the beginning of globalization, and, honestly, globalization seemed to be a good thing. It seemed to be a way to expand markets and think differently about the economy. People were pretty excited about it. And the last area is culture. During the 1990s, a lot of people were pretty happy. There were culture wars. These were the debates over the roles and status of women, the role and possible inclusion of LGBT people, and immigrants were also under debate. The Conservative Party had been influenced heavily by the religious right by this point, while the Democrats seemed to be more interested in a secular, open society. There wasn't much agreement about the direction of the nation culturally, but somehow we survived. So the question is, what happened? George H.W. Bush might not have had the charisma of Ronald Reagan, but in many ways he was a better equipped and skilled man as a president. He won the election in 1988 handily for a variety of reasons, and one of his few liabilities was his choice of vice president, Dan Quayle. Many Americans viewed him as a bit of a joke, that being Quayle. Bush came into the election with a strong economy, campaigning on traditional Republican platform of low taxes and law and order. His campaign will always be remembered for a soundbite from one of his speeches, "Read my lips, no new taxes," mainly because he could not uphold the promise. At the time, people were also interested in his campaign because he ran attack ads against Michael Dukakis, especially focusing on Willie Horton. Willie Horton was a convicted murderer who had raped a woman while on a prison furlough from prison in Massachusetts, while Dukakis had been governor. The Democrats could not bounce back, and Bush received 54.4% of the vote and won 38 states. Not bad. While the people elected a Republican president, Democrats controlled both the House and the Senate. Congress passes laws, but the Supreme Court seemed to be taking on a decidedly conservative turn. Reagan had appointed Sandra Day O'Connor and Anthony Kennedy, and now Bush had the chance to appoint two justices as well, and that ended up being Justice David Souter and Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas turned out to be a controversial choice. The NAACP opposed him, the Urban League opposed him, and other black groups opposed him. I think you can see where this is going. But then Anita Hill had something to say. Hill, a law professor, accused him of sexual harassment when the two worked together. Despite that, Republicans in the Senate rallied to get him confirmed. He followed the conservative voting patterns of Chief Justice William Rehnquist and Justice Antonin Scalia. This meant for years to come, liberal issues would be hot-button topics, including abortion and then the issue of gay rights, as we have seen recently. In protest, women voters in the 1992 election responded by putting more women in Congress. Bush's main political problems, however, stem from the huge budget deficit bequeathed by Ronald Reagan. In 1985, Congress had enacted the Gramm-Rudman Act, which mandated automatic cuts in government programs in 1991 if the budget remained wildly out of balance. The most obvious solution was to cut spending and raise taxes. Bush abandoned his no new taxes pledge, angering conservative Republicans and ruining his chance for re-election. The election of 1992 pitted Bush against both the more charismatic, more moderate Bill Clinton and a third-party candidate, H. Ross Perot. Perot condemned the rising federal deficit and the influence of corporate lobbyists on Washington, D.C. He took 19% of the vote away from one of those candidates, and many of those votes probably would have gone to Bush. With 43% of the vote, Clinton came into office and won a second term in 1996. He made a great comeback after some earlier failures in office, but he also faced a Republican-dominated Congress in his second term. Clinton will probably be best known for his sex scandals as long as my generation is living. Yet Americans often forget he was instrumental in getting the U.S. back into the black with a balanced budget. Neither Reagan nor Bush had been able to control the economy due to the increased spending of the Reagan years. Clinton took effective action to reduce the budget deficits of his predecessors. In 1993, he secured a 5-year budget package that would reduce the budget deficit by $500 billion. Republicans initially refused to approve it because it included tax increases on the rich and corporations. But by 1998, Clinton's fiscal policies had balanced the budget and began to pay down the federal debt. As a result, the economy boomed. During Clinton's second term, a sex scandal led to his impeachment. Under oath, Clinton swore that he had not sexually harassed Paula Jones, a former Arkansas employee who he had known when he was a governor in that state. It probably could have ended there, but he also denied having an affair with Monica Lewinsky, a White House intern, which proved to be true. There were Clinton haters in the Congress, and conservative Republicans vowed to oust him for his liberal social views. They had their chance, and in 1998, when the House brought forward 2 articles of impeachment for lying about Lewinsky and the affair, and also obstruction of justice. Basically, he got others to lie for him. Most Americans, however, 58%, according to one poll, did not approve of the impeachment proceedings. But this was a political move. Republicans failed to gain the 2/3 vote they needed in the Senate to actually convict him of impeachment. The Democrats in the nation paid a high price, as it hurt the Democrats' ability to focus on domestic issues and Clinton's ability to focus on foreign policy. Let's look at foreign policy and foreign policy issues of the 1990s, which can shed some light on our current troubles in the Middle East. If you listen to the Reagan lecture, you should have a picture of how the U.S. government got involved in Afghanistan covertly. While Afghanistan has gained our attention, at the time the Middle East, that's the oil-rich land stretching from Iran to Algeria, overall presented new problems to the United States and its leaders. There we found viable threats to the nation's security. During Reagan's administration, America's enemy had been communism, which usually meant Russians were the bad guys wearing the black hats, while the U.S. wore the white hats and worked to defeat the enemy. But now, without a clear and identifiable enemy, things got more complicated, and American diplomats had to deal with regional, religious, and ethnic conflicts that defied easy solutions. In 1980, the Iraqis, under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, attacked Iran, then headed by Ayatollah Khomeini. The war stemmed from boundary disputes over deep-water ports, important to shipping oil and making profits. The fighting was intense and long-lasting, resulting in 1 million casualties. Reagan's administration ignored Hussein's brutal repression of political opponents and the murder of thousands of Iraqi Kurds, instead providing military intelligence to Hussein. Reagan's people wanted to maintain supplies of Iraqi oil and undermine Iran, which President Reagan had called an outlaw state. By 1998, the war ended with an armistice. In 1990, Saddam Hussein again went to war to expand Iraq's boundaries and oil supply. His troops quickly conquered Kuwait, an oil-rich neighbor, and threatened Saudi Arabia, the Middle East's big dog. 1/5 of the world's known oil supplies were in Saudi Arabia, and it was an informal ally of the United States. George Bush, now president, utilized the UN and prodded its members to authorize force against Iraq. Demonstrating diplomatic finesse, the president organized a military coalition of 34 nations. Congress approved of American participation. The war was on. Instead of occupying Iraq or bringing Hussein down, he urged through the United Nations the passage of UN Resolution 687. This forced Iraq to allow unfettered inspections of its weapon systems and forced it also to destroy its biological and chemical weapons, as well as forcing the nation to pledge not to develop nuclear weapons. President Clinton was unprepared as he came into office for many of the foreign policy problems that would pop up during his presidency. He lamented, "Foreign policy is not what I came here to do." His advisors provided little leadership for problems arising in Somalia, Haiti, Yugoslavia and the Balkans, and the West Bank. More important for understanding the world you live in now, extremist Muslims in various countries sparked new conflicts. Radical Islamic groups staged armed insurgencies in Russia and China, and we saw threats in Algeria, Egypt, Pakistan, and Indonesia, as well as the United States. In 1993, radical Muslim immigrants set off a bomb in the World Trade Center in New York City. 5 years later, Muslim terrorists used truck bombs to blow up American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. Al-Qaeda had emerged as a scary and dangerous network of terrorists funded by wealthy Osama bin Laden, but the people in the State Department, CIA, and Pentagon did not know how to fight these new enemies. The men in charge had grown up in the era of the Cold War. One enemy and an easy basic doctrine: containment. CIA Director James Woolsey observed about this that "we have slain a large dragon. We live now in a jungle filled with a bewildering variety of poisonous snakes, and in many ways the dragon was easier to keep track of." So now we had leaders who understood the Cold War trying to fight Muslim terrorists. It would take a different man to focus the nation on terrorism, and the election of 2000 brought that man into office. In 2000, George W. Bush of Texas challenged the Democrats headed by the Veep Al Gore. With the supremely gifted strategist Karl Rove by his side, Bush and the Republicans ran an organized, understandable campaign, one deploring political partisanship. Bush said at one point he was a uniter, not a divider. And it was also known for bringing on also campaigned for bringing on a compassionate conservatism. Gore, despite a lack of clear message, rode in on Clinton's prosperity and suffered from a third party sapping his votes. The result was a close and contested election that can remind us of an election in 1876. Gore won the popular vote with 50.9 votes, but Bush ran off with the electoral college votes. Recounts were started. but the Supreme Court stepped in and ended it with Bush versus Gore. The election went to W. Winning the election brought in the person who would drive foreign policy and America's conduct as a global power. The United States had been the hegemonic power in the world after the fall of the USSR, meaning the U.S. was unrivaled in power and had a predominant influence on the world as of 2001. Bush's administration, led by neoconservatives, championed a benevolent hegemony, the untrammeled use of America's power, military power if need be, to fashion a better, more democratic world. This means that the United States needed to be strong and flex its muscles when needed. Then came 9/11. 19 al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked 4 commercial jets. The World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and a final unknown location were the targets. For my generation, many thought, again, regarding the World Trade Center towers. Bush proclaimed a war on terror. Terrorists were not new, but now the U.S. had a major attack on U.S. soil and the presidential administration with the policy to attack that institution of terror. Al-Qaeda had been operating out of Afghanistan, harbored by the fundamentalist Taliban regime. A complicated situation required a complicated approach. In military terms, that's referred to as unconventional warfare. The U.S. bolstered anti-Taliban rebel forces with advisors and supplies. The Afghanis fought the ground war while the U.S. used planes to bomb the enemy. By 2002, Osama bin Laden's camps were destroyed and the Taliban had been ousted. But terrorists aren't tied to nations. Bin Laden's followers escaped over the border to Pakistan. It was not over. Out of this, Congress passed the USA Patriot Act. This gave the government sweeping authority to monitor citizens and apprehend suspected terrorists. In the name of terror, the government, under the small government party, got a lot of power to hunt down terrorists. There was a lot of concern about privacy when this act passed. While there was some unfinished business, Bush could have declared victory and cleaned up the rest of the mess in Afghanistan as a part of a post-victory operational phase. President Bush, however, viewed the war on terror as a real thing, an open-ended war that required a greater commitment. Observers have used the term Bush Doctrine to describe the Bush administration's policies in the war on terror. International law allows for nations to strike first, meaning start a war, if there is an imminent threat. Under the Bush Doctrine, the United States reserved the right to act in anticipatory self-defense. Moreover, Bush singled out Iran, North Korea, and Iraq as an axis of evil and as prospective targets. In the case of Iraq, there seemed to be more to do despite the first Gulf War. Saddam Hussein had remained in power, and the Bush administration assumed that surely the Iraqis would abandon their dictator and adopt democracy if given the chance. This would create a toppling effect that would lead to democracy spreading through the Middle East. Here we have Teddy Roosevelt's big stick, Woodrow Wilson's love of democracy, and a sort of reverse domino theory. Don't forget, a really big bill for war expenditures. To make a long, expensive story short, I will get to the point. The United States used the UN to search for non-existent weapons of mass destruction. This all goes back to the first Gulf War with that UN resolution. Despite finding none, the United States invaded Iraq in March 2003. Saddam Hussein's government collapsed, but Sunni Muslims started an insurgency which made this a war that would be harder to fight. Johnson learned this lesson in Vietnam. Russia's Brezhnev learned it in Afghanistan. The United States had become unwanted invaders and didn't understand why. As of 2004, the United States had spent $100 billion or more, lost 1,000 men, and witnessed the wounding of 10,000 more to create another quagmire. Since then, it's even bigger. That was not the end, but more than that I cannot say much. This is all really hard to assess without the distance of time, but the debt is climbing and it is real and no one wants to talk about it. Strangely, the politicians talk a lot about deficits, but not the expense of this war. Why can't we talk about the expense of the war? With that said, this is the end of part 1. Please continue listening to part 2 for a discussion of technology, globalization, and the conclusion of the lecture where we'll tie this all together.